It was a crisp autumn evening in the suburbs of Atlanta, where perfectly manicured lawns stretched alongside massive oak trees that had witnessed decades of change in the neighborhood. Officer James Mitchell sat in his patrol car, sipping coffee that had long since gone cold. His eyes constantly scanned the quiet streets, but his mind was already made up about what, or rather who, he was looking for. The setting sun cast long shadows across the expensive homes as Mitchell noticed a sleek black Mercedes approaching. His eyes narrowed when he spotted the driver, a well-dressed black woman who appeared to be in her mid-30s. Without hesitation, he pulled out behind the vehicle, following it for several blocks before flipping on his lights for what he would later claim was a routine traffic stop. The Mercedes pulled over smoothly, coming to rest under a street light that had just flickered to life. Mitchell took his time approaching the car, his hand resting unnecessarily on his holster, a habit he developed over years of what he called careful policing, but what department statistics quietly labeled as discriminatory practices. Through the window, he could see the driver sitting perfectly still, hands placed at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. She wore a tailored business suit, and her car's interior was immaculate. This didn't fit Mitchell's usual narrative, but he'd already decided something wasn't right. In his mind, this neighborhood was meant for the doctors and lawyers he pictured when he took this beat, and they didn't look like her. License and registration, he barked, shining his flashlight directly into the car despite the perfectly adequate street lighting. The woman's calm response only irritated him further. She moved with deliberate slowness, announcing each movement before she made it. "I'm reaching for my purse now, officer. It's on the passenger seat." Her voice carried an air of authority that Mitchell found unsettling. Most people he pulled over were nervous, apologetic, or angry. But this woman showed none of those emotions. Instead, she handled herself with a professional confidence that made him uncomfortable, though he couldn't explain why. The license she handed over was pristine, her insurance and registration up to date. The car was registered in her name, and her address matched one of the most expensive streets in the area. But Mitchell wasn't satisfied. Something about her composure felt like a challenge to his authority. He ran her information through the system, growing increasingly frustrated when nothing suspicious came up. The woman waited patiently, occasionally checking her phone, but otherwise remaining still. Mitchell watched her in his rearview mirror, convinced she was hiding something. When he returned to her window, his questions became more probing, more accusatory. "Where are you coming from? Where are you heading? Do you live around here? Can anyone verify your story?" Each answer she provided was clear and direct, but Mitchell's suspicion only grew. Other cars passed by slowly, their drivers rubbernecking at the scene. Mitchell noticed some of his regular residents, the ones who always waved and thanked him for keeping their neighborhood safe, watching with interest. He felt pressure to justify the stop, to prove his instincts right. The woman's continued composure pushed him over the edge. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice carrying the weight of years of unchecked authority. She complied without argument, but there was something in her eyes, not fear or anger, but a knowing look that made Mitchell's skin prickle. As the crisp evening air filled with the sound of approaching sirens, backup Mitchell had called without real cause. Neither of them could have guessed how this routine traffic stop would completely transform not just their lives, but the entire department's future. The woman stood calmly as Mitchell reached for his handcuffs, her silence more powerful than any protest could have been. This wasn't going to be the story Mitchell thought he was writing. It was about to become something much bigger. Little did Officer Mitchell know, his whole world was about to be turned upside down. All because he chose the wrong car to pull over on this quiet autumn evening. The events that would unfold from this moment would shake not just his beliefs, but the very foundation of everything he thought he knew about his role as a police officer. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife as Mitchell watched the woman turn and face him. Her business suit was worth more than his monthly salary, but that only made him more suspicious. The backup units he called pulled up with their lights flashing, casting eerie blue shadows across the well-manicured lawns of the suburban street. "Is there a problem, Officer Mitchell?" she asked calmly, reading his nameplate. Her voice carried no hint of fear or anger, just a steady confidence that made him increasingly uncomfortable. He'd dealt with all kinds of reactions during traffic stops before: tears, rage, begging. But this composed demeanor was different. It felt like she was watching him, studying his every move. "Ma'am, I have reason to believe you're not being truthful about your presence in this neighborhood," Mitchell said, his voice gruff with authority. A small crowd of residents had gathered at a safe distance, watching the scene unfold. Some had their phones out, recording everything. The woman's response was unexpected. She smiled, not a mocking smile, but one that suggested she knew something he didn't. "Officer," she said quietly, "I understand you're doing your job, but I want you to think very carefully about your next actions." Mitchell felt his face grow hot. Was she threatening him? He'd dealt with what he called attitude before, but something about her calm warning made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Still, he couldn't back down now, not with his fellow officers watching. "Place your hands behind your back," he ordered, pulling out his handcuffs. The metal clinked in the evening air, drawing gasps from the onlookers. The woman complied without resistance, but her eyes never left his face. As he secured the cuffs, she spoke just loud enough for him to hear. "You know, Officer Mitchell, sometimes the biggest lessons come from our most misguided moments. This will be one of those times for you." His fellow officers exchanged glances as they watched him escort her to his patrol car. One of them, Officer Chen, approached with a concerned look. "James, are you sure about this? What's the charge?" Mitchell mumbled something about suspicious activity and potential fraud, but even to his own ears, the words sounded hollow. The woman said nothing as she was placed in the back seat, maintaining her dignified composure that somehow made him feel smaller with each passing moment. The drive to the station was unusually quiet. Mitchell kept glancing in his rearview mirror, expecting to see signs of nervousness or worry from his arrestee. Instead, she sat there calmly, occasionally looking out the window as if she was merely on an evening drive. At the station, things started to feel different. The desk sergeant looked up as Mitchell brought her in, and his eyes widened in recognition. Before Mitchell could start the booking process, the sergeant quickly picked up his phone and made a call, turning away to speak in hushed tones. Within minutes, the station's atmosphere changed dramatically. The usual bustle of the precincts slowed to a crawl as higher-ranking officers began emerging from their offices. Mitchell noticed his colleagues' expressions shifting from curiosity to concern. The woman stood patiently at the booking desk, still handcuffed, still composed. A hint of a smile played at the corners of her mouth as heavy footsteps approached from the captain's office. Mitchell's stomach began to knot as he watched his captain's face turn from his usual confident expression to one of barely contained panic. "Officer Mitchell," the captain's voice cut through the suddenly silent station. "Uncuff her. Now." The command was sharp, leaving no room for question or delay. As Mitchell fumbled with the handcuff keys, his mind raced. Who was this woman? Why was everyone acting so strange? The metal cuffs clicked open, and she rubbed her wrists gently, finally turning to face the room of now silent officers. The captain stepped forward, his face a mix of embarrassment and respect. "Officer Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet room, "I believe it's time you met your new Federal Oversight Director." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, and Mitchell felt the ground beneath his feet shift metaphorically as the full weight of his mistake began to dawn on him. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of a story that would change not just his life, but the entire department's future. The woman's identity was about to shatter every preconception he'd built his career upon, and the real lesson was about to begin. The police station buzzed with nervous energy as Officer Mitchell stood frozen, his face draining of color. The woman he'd just arrested straightened her suit jacket and pulled out a leather wallet from her pocket. With one smooth motion, she flipped it open to reveal a gleaming FBI badge. "I'm the new Federal Director of Law Enforcement Reform," she announced, her voice carrying through the now silent station. "I was actually on my way to a meeting with your chief when Officer Mitchell here decided to conduct what he called a routine traffic stop." Mitchell felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. His ears were ringing, and he could feel dozens of eyes drilling into him from every direction. Some of his fellow officers looked away uncomfortably, while others watched the scene unfold with a mix of sympathy and second-hand embarrassment. The captain quickly ushered everyone into the main conference room. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Mitchell took a seat, feeling smaller by the minute. The federal director remained standing, her presence commanding the room without effort. "Let's review what happened tonight," she began, pulling out a small recorder from her briefcase. "Officer Mitchell followed my vehicle for 3 blocks before initiating a stop. No traffic violation had occurred. When asked for probable cause, he provided none. When my credentials checked out, he still proceeded with an unlawful arrest." Mitchell wanted to defend himself, to explain his actions, but every reason he had earlier now sounded hollow even in his own mind. The worst part was how the director wasn't even angry. She was completely professional, stating facts as if reading a weather report. "This isn't just about tonight," she continued, pulling out a thick folder. "We've been monitoring this department for months. Officer Mitchell, your stop and arrest records show a disturbing pattern." She began laying out papers on the conference table, statistics, graphs, complaint reports. Mitchell's stomach churned as he saw his career laid bare in cold, hard numbers. The captain shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Director, I assure you we take these matters very seriously." "Do you?" she interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "Because according to these reports, Officer Mitchell has received 3 formal complaints about racial profiling in the past year alone. All were dismissed without investigation." The silence in the room was deafening. Mitchell could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He was supposed to be the good guy, the one protecting the neighborhood. How had everything turned upside down so quickly? The director walked over to the window, looking out at the parking lot where just an hour ago she'd been in handcuffs. "You know what's interesting, Officer Mitchell? While you were running my license and registration, I was on the phone with my team. They were coordinating with your nephew's protection detail." Mitchell's head snapped up. "My nephew?" "Yes," she said, turning back to face him. "The one who's been under FBI protection for the past 6 months after witnessing a major crime. I personally oversee his case. In fact, I visited him just last week. Lovely young man. He speaks very highly of his Uncle James." The revelation hit Mitchell like a physical blow. His nephew, his beloved sister's son, had been protected by the very person he profiled and arrested. The same woman he treated with suspicion and contempt had been keeping his family safe. "Sometimes," the director said softly, "we don't realize our prejudices until they're staring us right in the face. Tonight could go one of 2 ways, Officer Mitchell. It could be the end of your career," she paused, letting the words sink in, "or it could be the beginning of something much more important." The room held its breath, waiting for what would come next. Mitchell sat there, his worldview crumbling around him, as he realized this moment would define not just his career, but who he was as a person. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking each second of this turning point in his life. The director picked up her badge from the table, studying it thoughtfully. "I have a proposition for you," she said, "but first, you need to understand exactly why what happened tonight was more than just a bad traffic stop. It's time for some uncomfortable truths, Officer Mitchell. Are you ready to listen?" The weight of the moment hung in the air, and Mitchell knew his answer would change everything. The real lesson was about to begin, and nothing would ever be the same again. The conference room felt smaller by the minute as the director pulled up a chair directly across from Officer Mitchell. The rest of the department staff sat in tense silence, watching this unexpected drama unfold. Outside, the evening had turned to night, and the fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across worried faces. Before we continue, the director said, pulling out her phone, "I'd like you to see something." She pressed play on a video. Footage from Mitchell's body camera from various traffic stops over the past year. Each clip showed a similar pattern. Minorities being pulled over in affluent neighborhoods, aggressive questioning, searches without clear cause. Mitchell's throat went dry as he watched himself on screen. Seeing his actions from this perspective was like looking in a mirror he'd been avoiding for years. His own voice sounded foreign to him, harsh, presumptuous, filled with an authority he'd never questioned until now. "Your nephew," the director continued, switching off the video, "was placed in our protection program after witnessing a hate crime. Did you know that?" She paused, letting the information sink in. He was terrified at first, not just of the criminals, but of law enforcement too. He'd seen too many examples of bias in his young life. The captain shifted uncomfortably in his seat, papers rustling under his nervous hands. The director's words were cutting through years of defensive protocols and dismissed complaints, laying bare a truth nobody in the room could deny any longer. "When I first met your nephew," she went on, her voice softening slightly, "he told me about his uncle who was a police officer. He said you were his hero, that you protected people. He believed in you so much that it helped him trust us. That trust kept him safe." Mitchell felt his eyes burning. The image of his young nephew, bright, kind, and yes, biracial, flooded his mind. How many times had he justified his actions on patrol while loving that boy? How had he never seen the contradiction? The director leaned forward, her voice firm, but not unkind. "Yesterday, I was part of the team that finally closed your nephew's case. The perpetrators are in custody, and he's safe. But tonight, you pulled me over for the same prejudices that fueled their hate." A heavy silence fell over the room. Some officers looked at their shoes, others stared straight ahead, but everyone felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about one traffic stop anymore. It was about patterns, systems, and the quiet biases that shaped them all. "Here's my proposition," the director said, opening her briefcase. "Instead of filing charges for civil rights violations, I want you to be part of the solution." She pulled out a thick document. "We're launching a new training program. Not the usual sensitivity training that everyone sleeps through. Real, ground-level change." Mitchell found his voice, though it came out rougher than he expected. "Why would you trust me with something like that? After what I did?" The director's response was immediate. "Because change has to start somewhere. Because your nephew believes in you. And because sometimes the best teachers are the ones who've learned the hardest lessons themselves." She laid out the program details, a comprehensive overhaul of department practices, with Mitchell playing a key role in sharing his experience and transformation. It wasn't a punishment, it was an opportunity for redemption. "I'm not asking you to change overnight," she explained, passing him the documents. "I'm asking you to start the journey. To look at each traffic stop, each interaction, each assumption, and question it. To remember how it felt to watch those body cam videos and know you can do better." The night shift was starting, and fresh officers were filtering into the station, catching glimpses of the unusual gathering through the conference room windows. They saw their fellow officers sitting there, badge and authority stripped away, facing a moment of truth. Mitchell looked down at the papers in front of him, then back at the director. He thought about his nephew's smile, about all the people he'd stopped over the years, about the woman he'd arrested just hours ago, who was now offering him a chance to make things right. "If I agree," he said slowly, "where do we start?" The director smiled, a real smile this time, reaching her eyes. "We start with tonight. Tell me, Officer Mitchell, what made you follow my car in the first place? Be honest. This is where change begins. The room leaned in, ready to witness the first step of what would become a much bigger story. One of transformation, redemption, and the hard work of real change. Officer Mitchell sat in the empty break room the next morning, his untouched coffee growing cold. The events of the previous night kept replaying in his mind as sunlight streamed through the dusty blinds. His phone buzzed again, another message from his sister. Word had gotten out about what happened, and his family was concerned. The internal affairs investigation had begun first thing in the morning. Mitchell watched through the window as his fellow officers were called in one by one to give statements. Some avoided eye contact as they passed, while others offered small nods of encouragement. The solidarity he once taken for granted felt different now. "Your coffee's getting cold," came a familiar voice. The director stood in the doorway, holding her own cup. Without waiting for an invitation, she sat down across from him. "Rough morning." Mitchell managed a weak smile. "You could say that. My sister called. She knows about last night." He paused, his voice growing quieter. "She asked how I could do that to someone who'd been protecting her son." "And what did you tell her?" the director asked, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "I couldn't answer," he admitted. "For the first time in my career, I had no explanation that made sense." He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had put handcuffs on the person who'd kept his nephew safe. "I've been looking through my stop records all morning. The patterns, they're so obvious now." The director nodded, pulling out a tablet. "I have something to show you," she said, sliding it across the table. On the screen was a video from a security camera outside the station. It showed Mitchell's patrol car arriving the night before, him leading her inside in handcuffs. "Watch the background," she instructed. Mitchell noticed people on the street stopping to record the scene on their phones. Some showed clear signs of anger, others resignation, as if they'd seen this story play out too many times before. "Those videos are already online," she explained. "But here's where it gets interesting." She swiped to a different screen showing social media reactions. "People are angry, yes. But they're also watching to see what happens next. This could be just another viral video of police bias, or it could be something different." Mitchell's shoulders slumped. A lesson in what not to do. "A story of change," she corrected. "Real change, not just policy updates and mandatory seminars. The kind that starts with one person admitting they got it wrong and wanting to do better." She pulled out a folder filled with community complaints, statistics, and incident reports. "Your record shows you're actually an excellent officer in many ways. Your response times are top-notch, you've saved lives, solved crimes. But these biased incidents, they're like a shadow over everything good you've done." Mitchell thought about his nephew again, about how proudly the boy had always pointed out his police officer uncle. "I keep thinking about all the people I've stopped," he said quietly. "How many times I told myself I was just being thorough, just doing my job. But watching those body cam videos last night, it's not easy to face our own biases," the director said. "Most people never do. But you're in a unique position now. You can help other officers see what you're seeing." Just then, Officer Chen poked his head into the break room. "Mitchell, Internal Affairs wants to see you now." The director stood up, gathering her things. "Remember what we talked about last night? Complete honesty. It's the only way forward." She paused at the door. "Oh, and Mitchell, your nephew asked about you this morning. He still believes in you. Don't let him down." As Mitchell walked towards the Internal Affairs office, he felt different. The weight of his badge, which had always made him feel powerful, now reminded him of responsibility, not just to enforce the law, but to be better than he'd been. Through the glass walls, he could see the investigators waiting with their files and recordings. This wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in his career, he was ready to look at his actions without excuses or defensiveness. The door clicked shut behind him as he entered, ready to face the truth about himself and his choices. The real work of change was about to begin, and Mitchell knew this was just the first step of many. But with his nephew's faith in him and an unexpected second chance, he was finally ready to take that step. The internal affairs interview lasted for 3 grueling hours. Mitchell's throat was dry from talking as he stepped out of the office into the afternoon sun. He told them everything. Every stop, every assumption, every moment of bias he could remember. It felt like draining an old wound he didn't know he had. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from his nephew. "Uncle James, can we talk? I'm at the park near your house." Mitchell's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't seen his nephew since the protective custody began, and now, after everything that had happened. 20 minutes later, he pulled into the park parking lot, still in his uniform. His nephew sat on a bench near the basketball court, taller than Mitchell remembered. 6 months had changed them both. "The director told me what happened," his nephew said as Mitchell sat down beside him. No hug, no smile, just direct words that felt like arrows. "She said you arrested her because she was black in a nice neighborhood." Mitchell felt the words hit him like physical blows. Hearing it from his nephew, this boy he'd watched grow up, who shared the same blood but lived a different reality, made it impossible to hide from the truth. "I heard the body cam recordings," his nephew continued, bouncing a basketball slowly. "That's not the Uncle James I used to tell everyone about. The one who taught me to ride a bike and came to all my games. He caught the ball and held it still. What happened to that person?" Mitchell watched a group of kids playing nearby, all different colors, laughing together without a thought about their differences. "I've been asking myself that same question," he admitted. "I got so caught up in what I thought protecting the neighborhood meant that I forgot what real protection looks like." His nephew turned to face him fully. "You know what scared me most when I was in protective custody? Not the bad guys. It was thinking about other cops like you, who might see me and decide I didn't belong somewhere. The director was the first one who made me feel safe." The irony wasn't lost on Mitchell. The same woman he'd handcuffed had been the one to protect his family when it mattered most. "I want to be better," he said quietly. "I have to be better. Not just for you, but for everyone I swore to protect and serve." "The director says you're going to help train other officers," his nephew said, a hint of hope creeping into his voice. "She says you're going to tell your story." Mitchell nodded. "It won't be easy. Some people won't want to hear it. But if I can help one officer see what I've seen." He paused, watching the setting sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Your mom told me you're thinking about becoming a police officer yourself someday." His nephew's eyes lit up for the first time since Mitchell arrived. "Yeah, I am. But I want to be the kind of officer who makes everyone feel safe, not just some people." "Then maybe you can help me," Mitchell said. "Help me understand what I need to change, what I need to learn. We could work on this together." The basketball court lights flickered on as dusk settled in. More families were arriving for evening games, their voices filling the air with a mix of languages and laughter. Mitchell saw it all differently now, not as something to be suspicious of, but as the beautiful variety of the community he was meant to serve. "I've got my first training session tomorrow," Mitchell said. Would you come with me? Share your perspective. People need to hear from someone who's seen both sides of this." His nephew smiled. A real smile this time, one that reminded Mitchell of easier days. "You really want my help?" "More than anything," Mitchell replied honestly. "I can't change what I did, but I can change what I do next, and I want to do it right this time." As they sat there, uncle and nephew, the distance between them began to shrink. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was clear. Sometimes the hardest lessons come from the people closest to us, and sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest conversations on a park bench at sunset. The police training center buzzed with nervous energy the next morning. Mitchell stood at the back of the room, watching as officers filed in for the first reform training session. His nephew stood beside him, fidgeting with his visitor badge, both of them feeling the weight of what they were about to do. The director stood at the front, commanding attention without saying a word. The room fell silent as she began. "Today isn't your usual training," she announced. "Today, we're going to hear a story. A real story about change, told by one of your own." Mitchell's feet felt heavy as he walked to the front. Familiar faces watched him. Partners he patrolled with, rookies he'd trained, veterans who'd been on the force longer than he had. Some looked skeptical, others curious, all waiting to see what would unfold. 3 days ago, he began, his voice shaking slightly, I made a traffic stop that changed everything. He glanced at his nephew for encouragement before continuing. I stopped someone because they didn't fit what I thought belonged in that neighborhood. And that someone turned out to be the person who'd been protecting my family all along. The room stayed silent as Mitchell played the body cam footage. He watched his colleagues' expressions change as they saw his interaction with the director that night. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps recognizing their own behaviors in his actions. But this isn't just about one traffic stop, Mitchell continued, clicking to the next slide. Charts and graphs appeared, showing patterns in his stops over the years. This is about patterns we might not even realize we're creating. Patterns that hurt real people, people like my nephew. His nephew stepped forward then, his young voice clear and strong. I used to tell everyone my uncle was a police officer, he said. I was so proud. But when I needed protection, I was scared of the police. Scared they'd see me the way my uncle saw the director that night. A veteran officer in the front row raised his hand. We're trained to look for suspicious activity, he argued. How are we supposed to do our jobs if we second-guess every stop? The director stepped in smoothly. Good question. Let's break down what suspicious really means. She pulled up more footage. Traffic stops from various officers, showing different approaches to the same situations. Notice the differences in how these situations were handled. Mitchell felt something shift in the room as officers began to engage, asking questions, sharing experiences. Some told stories about times they'd realized their own biases, others admitted to struggles with similar situations. The conversation became real, honest, sometimes uncomfortable, but always moving forward. His nephew shared more about his experience in protective custody, about how the director's team had made him feel safe while respecting his dignity. That's what real police work looks like, he said. Making everyone feel protected, not just some people. As the morning wore on, Mitchell saw changes in his colleagues' faces. The defensive crossed arms relaxed, the skeptical expressions softened. When they broke for lunch, several officers stayed behind to talk more, to share their own stories, to ask questions they'd never dared ask before. One rookie officer approached Mitchell, her eyes serious. I've been worried about some of my recent stops, she admitted quietly. I didn't know who to talk to about it. But after today, would you be willing to review some of my body cam footage with me? The director watched these interactions with a slight smile, letting the natural conversations flow. This wasn't just training anymore. It was the beginning of real change, spreading through the department one honest conversation at a time. As the afternoon session began, Mitchell stood straighter, spoke more confidently. He looked at his nephew, who nodded encouragingly, and felt a new kind of pride. Not the old pride of authority and power, but the pride of helping to build something better, something lasting. This is just the start, he told the room. We've got a long way to go. But if we're willing to be honest with ourselves, to listen to our community, to learn from our mistakes, we can become the kind of police force every kid can be proud of, the kind that truly serves and protects everyone. The setting sun cast long shadows through the training room windows, but for the first time in days, Mitchell felt like he was standing in the light. 3 months had passed since that first training session. Mitchell sat in his patrol car, watching the morning traffic flow through the neighborhood. Everything looked the same, but his perspective had changed completely. His radio crackled with routine calls as he thought about how far things had come. The department had transformed in subtle but significant ways. Officers now gathered for weekly discussion groups, sharing experiences and challenging each other's assumptions. Mitchell led many of these sessions, his story becoming a powerful tool for change. Even the most resistant officers had begun to show signs of understanding. His nephew had become a regular presence at the station, initially drawing curious looks but eventually becoming part of the fabric of the department. He'd started a youth outreach program, bringing local teenagers to meet officers in a relaxed setting. The same kids who once crossed the street to avoid police now stopped to chat. The director pulled up beside Mitchell's patrol car, rolling down her window. "Ready for today?" she asked. Mitchell nodded, thinking about the upcoming community meeting. These monthly gatherings had become a cornerstone of their new approach. Real conversations with the people they served. Inside the community center, chairs filled quickly. Faces both familiar and new turned toward the front as Mitchell took the podium. He spotted his sister in the crowd, sitting next to his nephew. She'd become one of their strongest supporters, helping bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. 6 months ago, Mitchell began, "I made a traffic stop that showed me how wrong I'd been about a lot of things. Today, I want to share some numbers with you." He clicked through slides showing dramatic changes in department statistics, more diverse hiring, fewer biased stops, improved community relations. An elderly gentleman stood up during the question period. "I've lived here 40 years, he said, his voice carrying years of experience. "Used to be, I'd warn my grandkids about police. Now, for the first time, I'm seeing real change. But will it last?" Mitchell looked at the director before answering. "Change isn't just about policies," he replied. "It's about people. Every day, we're working to build trust, to learn from our mistakes, to do better. And we're not doing it alone." His nephew stepped forward then, wearing the volunteer badge that had become like a second skin. "When my uncle arrested the director that night, I thought everything was ruined," he said. "But sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes. Now we're working together to make things better." The room buzzed with energy as more people shared their stories. Good and bad experiences with law enforcement, hopes for the future, suggestions for improvement. Mitchell watched his fellow officers listening intently, taking notes, engaging in real dialogue. After the meeting, a young officer approached Mitchell. "Remember that body cam review you did with me?" she asked. "Yesterday, I had a situation that could have gone badly, but I remembered what you taught us. I took a step back, checked my assumptions. We ended up having a real conversation instead of a confrontation." The director joined them, a small smile playing on her lips. "That's exactly what we're aiming for," she said. "Every interaction is a chance to build trust or break it. We're choosing to build it, one encounter at a time." Outside, the evening was settling in. Mitchell watched as people lingered in the parking lot, officers and community members chatting casually. His nephew was showing a group of kids the inside of a patrol car, their excited voices carrying across the lot. "You know," the director said, standing beside him, "when I first came to this department, I wasn't sure change was possible. But watching you these past months, how you've faced your mistakes, how you've worked to make things right, it's shown me that real transformation is possible." Mitchell thought about all the changes, big and small. The uncomfortable conversations that led to better understanding. The policies that now reflected community needs. The officers who approached their work with new awareness. Most importantly, the trust that was slowly, steadily growing. His radio buzzed with another call. As he headed to his car, he saw his reflection in the window. Same uniform, same badge, but a different person wearing them. Sometimes the biggest changes start with one mistake, one moment of truth, one chance to make things right. 1 year to the day after that fateful traffic stop, Mitchell stood backstage at the National Law Enforcement Conference. The auditorium was packed with officers from across the country, all gathered to hear about the remarkable transformation of one police department. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie. The director stood nearby, reviewing her notes one last time. "Nervous?" she asked, glancing up with a knowing smile. "A little," Mitchell admitted. "A year ago, I was the problem. Now I'm supposed to be part of the solution." He looked out at the growing crowd through a gap in the curtain. His nephew sat in the front row, now wearing a junior police academy uniform, beaming with pride. The lights dimmed, and the police chief stepped up to introduce them. "What happened in our department wasn't just a story of one traffic stop gone wrong," he began. "It's a story of how real change happens when we're brave enough to face our mistakes and determined enough to fix them." Mitchell took deep breaths as he walked onto the stage. The spotlight felt warm on his face as he looked out at hundreds of attentive faces. Some skeptical, some curious, all waiting to hear what he had to say. "A year ago," he started, his voice growing stronger with each word, "I arrested someone because of my own prejudices. That person turned out to be the FBI director who had been protecting my nephew. But instead of ending my career, she helped me start a journey that would change everything." The presentation screen behind him showed photos and videos of the department's transformation. Community meetings that once started tense now filled with laughter and real conversation. Officers and citizens working together on neighborhood projects. His nephew's youth program growing from a handful of kids to hundreds. "We stopped making excuses," Mitchell continued, "and started making changes. Real changes, not just on paper, but in how we think and act every day." He shared their statistics. Complaints down by 70%, community trust up by 80%, crime rates dropping as cooperation increased. The director joined him on stage, and together they explained their new training program. How they used real experiences to show officers their blind spots. How they taught them to question their assumptions. How they built bridges instead of walls. But the most powerful change, Mitchell said, his voice softening, happened in here. He touched his chest. When we stopped seeing us versus them, and started seeing just us. All of us together, making our community better. His nephew stood up then, right on cue, and walked to the stage. The audience watched in silence as this young man, who had once feared the police, now proudly stood beside his uncle in uniform. "My uncle made a mistake," his nephew told the crowd. "But he also showed me that it's not about being perfect. It's about being willing to learn, to change, to do better. That's what real courage looks like." Questions came from the audience. Honest, sometimes difficult questions about resistance to change, about old habits, about fear. Mitchell answered them all with the same honesty that had started his journey. "Change isn't easy," he acknowledged. "Some officers left our department. Others struggled. But the ones who stayed, who did the hard work of looking at themselves in the mirror, they're better officers now. Better people." As the session ended, officers lined up to talk more. Some shared similar stories, others asked for help starting programs in their own departments. The director watched it all with satisfaction, knowing their story was spreading, creating ripples of change across the country. Later, as they packed up their materials, Mitchell found a quiet moment to reflect. A year ago, he'd been at his lowest point, facing the consequences of his prejudices. Now he was helping other officers avoid those same mistakes. His nephew appeared beside him, grinning. "Ready to go, Uncle James. Mom's making dinner for everyone." Mitchell looked around the emptying auditorium, at the director chatting with other police chiefs, at the positive energy still buzzing in the air. "Yeah," he said, smiling. "I'm ready." As they walked out together, uncle and nephew, officer and future officer, Mitchell thought about how one moment of truth had changed everything. Sometimes the biggest mistakes lead to the most important lessons, and sometimes the hardest falls help us rise the highest. The department they returned to wasn't perfect, but it was better. And it kept getting better, one day at a time, one interaction at a time, one changed heart at a time. That was the real victory, not just fixing what was broken, but building something stronger in its place.